This is the Cape Fear River, the largest river in the state, and the only one in North Carolina that has direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. It stretches for 147 miles into the Carolina Piedmont and is navigable all the way to Fayetteville, North Carolina. Winding through coastal plain and sandhills, the Cape Fear River Basin is the largest watershed in the state, and more people live near it than anywhere else in North Carolina. Its brown water gets its color from the tannins it contains, the remnants of vegetation that are a signature of this crucial waterway. For 3.5 centuries, it has been the single thing that ties southeastern North Carolina together. Early explorers along the Carolina coast first located the Cape Fear River in the 16th and 17th centuries. Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón of Spain called it the River Jordan, while later English explorers like William Hilton named it the Charles River, after King Charles II of England. Efforts to colonize the region began in the 1660s. Puritans from New England tried to plant a settlement below modern Wilmington, but were unsuccessful. A year later, in 1664, Barbadian settlers under John Vassall were granted a patent by the Lords Proprietors of Carolina to establish a colony at the mouth of Town Creek in Brunswick County. The settlement lasted 3 years until a combination of neglect by the Lords Proprietors, trouble with the local Indians, the establishment of a new settlement at Port Royal in South Carolina, and a vicious hurricane doomed it to failure too. In 1725, Maurice and Roger Moore founded Brunswick, on the west side of the river across from a giant sand dune called Sugarloaf on mariners' maps. Brunswick became the first successful settlement in the region, and the official port of entry for North Carolina. Ships from all over the world called at Brunswick, bringing in cargoes of manufactured goods and taking away loads of tar, pitch, and turpentine to be used in Britain's great merchant and naval fleets. Roads were virtually non-existent, and those that did exist were poor. The Cape Fear River was the highway that allowed inland settlements to get their goods to markets at Brunswick and Wilmington cheaply and quickly. Planters from further inland would make huge rafts of their logs and float them downriver to market. These images are of the last log float from Bladen County in 1957. Wilmington, 12 miles above Brunswick, grew into the new major port after its founding in 1739. It quickly eclipsed Brunswick when the seat of government and courts moved there, leaving the older port to wither away. Brunswick finally ceased to exist as a functioning town after the British sacked it in 1776 during the Revolutionary War. In the early years, naval stores, that tar, pitch, and turpentine we mentioned earlier, timber, and other forest products were the chief export produced along the river. But as time wore on, rice became a staple that was very profitable for plantation owners along the Cape Fear. Because the Cape Fear River is a tidal river, rice planters were able to use its rising and falling fresh waters to grow the Carolina Gold variety of the grain that the Low Country is noted for. The Cape Fear River marks the northernmost boundary of rice cultivation in the United States. It was the river itself that made rice possible in southeastern North Carolina. As North Carolina's only river with direct access to the Atlantic, the Cape Fear River has always played an important role in military plans involving the colony and state. Since it stretches far into the Carolina interior, controlling the Cape Fear was a key requirement for anyone seeking to subdue the North Carolina countryside. For many years, the sparsely populated North Carolina coastline, with its many coves, bays, barrier islands, and sounds, was a favorite hideout for those who sailed against Spain. Spanish privateers raided the port at Brunswick one sleepy Sunday morning in September. The Spanish caught the townspeople by surprise, and Brunswick's residents took to the woods to get away. As the Spanish began looting the town, militia reinforcements from Wilmington arrived and drove the Spanish back to their ships during a raging battle. One of the Spanish ships exploded before the privateers were driven off. A cannon in the Brunswick Town Fort Anderson State Historic Site lobby came from the sunken Spanish ship. The Cape Fear River played a key role in the Revolutionary War. British troops anchored in the river in 1776 in the aftermath of the Loyalist loss at the Battle of Moores Creek before sailing south to attempt taking Charleston. In 1781, the 82nd Regiment of Foot under Major James Henry Craig occupied Wilmington for the better part of a year during Cornwallis's southern campaign. Fighting was fierce along the river and the creeks and streams that fed it, as partisan forces led by people like Loyalist David Fanning and others clashed to control North Carolina. A British prison ship was anchored off of Sugarloaf during the occupation. It was not until Patriot forces were able to turn their attention south after Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown that Craig and his men finally retreated to Charleston, sailing off down the river in the same ships that had delivered them to Wilmington months earlier. When war broke out between North and South in 1861, the Cape Fear River immediately played a key role. Southeastern North Carolina's geography was such that the Confederate port at Wilmington could not be shelled by blockading Federal warships in the Atlantic. It was just too far inland. That meant the only way to take the port was either overland from the north or west, or by coming up the Cape Fear River. Confederate war planners countered the threat by building 11 major forts and batteries along the river from Old Inlet at Bald Head Island, all the way up to the city itself. The two largest installations, Fort Fisher and Fort Anderson, proved to be formidable obstacles to Union forces. They also made the Wilmington port a favorite of blockade runners, bringing in vital cargoes for Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia. In 1864 and early 1865, the U.S. Navy sent the largest fleet in U.S. history until that time to take Fort Fisher and close Wilmington. The first attack, on Christmas Eve 1864, failed, but Union ships returned 2 weeks later. After a bombardment that would be the largest in the history of the world until World War II, Federal troops took the fort after a day of savage hand-to-hand fighting. A month later, Fort Anderson, built on the west bank of the Cape Fear River over the ruins of colonial Brunswicktown, fell to Union troops. The collapse of the fort was hurried along by Federal gunboats and monitors in the river that took up positions to shell Fort Anderson. After that, the fall of Wilmington was all but assured. After the Civil War, the Cape Fear River was not a scene of combat again. Still, it played a major role in future conflicts by virtue of its proximity to the Atlantic. In both World War I and World War II, shipyards along the Cape Fear turned out concrete Liberty ships to supply European allies with the food and munitions they needed to survive the enemy onslaught. Soldiers trained against drones and surface targets at Fort Fisher and Fort Caswell. Anti-submarine patrols flew out of Cape Fear airfields, flanking the river to thwart the U-boat menace into the graveyard of the Atlantic. For more than 3.5 centuries, the one thing that has been a constant in southeastern North Carolina has been the Cape Fear River. Its waters have seen pirates and plantations, Indians and Englishmen, redcoats, rebels, and soldiers in blue and gray. It has made men rich and turned others into paupers. Our crops depend on it, and our people drink of its waters and use it to provide the 1,000,001 different things we need good, fresh water for. It is, as it has always been, North Carolina's essential river.